Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this Bellwether LinkedIn Live. For those of you who are new to Bellwether, we're a national nonprofit. We work with a range of organizations, school districts, state education departments, charter school networks, policy advocates, vendors, nonprofits, others, to help them solve challenges, create better educational opportunities and experiences for young people. Our producer will throw in the chat a link. You can learn more about our work rather than belabor it here. But we publish a variety of field-facing work, as well as a lot of proprietary stuff. And then we host lots of conversations like this to help leaders, policymakers, everyone else who cares about our education system to make sense of the most pressing challenges that are facing us. Couple of housekeeping notes before we jump in. Feel free to ask any questions using the comments, and we're going to leave time at the end to get to those, and we'll be monitoring that. If you need to leave early, you can come back. You'll be able to watch this as soon as it's done. It'll be up on LinkedIn. You can watch it on demand. The only difference there is you can't ask questions, but you can certainly watch it later. And also check out our newsletter. We'll put a link in the comments for our newsletter too. You can sign up, and that's a great way to find out more about different events we're doing and so forth. We have a terrific set of panelists this morning to talk about math, and I'm excited to introduce them, and I think you'll learn more about them and their work as we go. My Bellwether colleague, Anson Jackson, is here. He's a former school system leader, school building leader. He leads a lot of our academic work that we do here in schools. He's based in Texas. We have another Texan. So I guess we're gonna hook 'em horns today. We have Sarah Powell. She's a professor at the College of Education at the University of Texas at Austin. So UT. Anson's not actually he's probably a little chafed at me for saying that. He's a proud, yeah, exactly. He's yeah, there we go. And then finally, we have Beth Zhang. She's co-president of Lavinia Group, and we're really excited, very deep on math, all three. And I'm excited to dive into this instruction. We want to talk about a couple of things. How do you bridge the gap between research-based practices and classroom instruction? If you're looking for more background on that, I'd point you to two things. We recently published an in-depth stock-taking report of math research and practices and policies. And you can check that out. That was in conjunction with the K-12 Coalition. And then Anson and I wrote, and you can find this on LinkedIn for HMH, a little bit about sort of systems and coherence. And you can check that out. Mackenzie can drop that in as well. But let's start at a really high, let's just start at a really high level here. We heard, the UC San Diego thing got a lot of attention, concern about how ready kids were for college. We see a lot of studies coming out about sort of math skills, level of achievement, and so forth. And it seems like to be a relatively constant theme in the media. Scores seem stuck, even though there is some indication they're improving. But the perception is they're stuck. So how did we sort of get to this point, Sarah, and unpack what are the math wars? Why are people so at odds over math? Let's start with you there, Sarah.
All right, yeah. Well, that's a lot of questions in one sentence.
A double-barreled one.
Yeah, yeah. So what we do see, as you emphasized, is that math scores in the United States really indicate that a majority of students are not meeting what we would consider a minimum level of math proficiency. And that's true at grade 4, and it gets worse at grade 8, and then it's pretty abysmal by grade 12. And it's really of concern for students who struggle with math, for students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and so on. And a lot of this was exacerbated by COVID-19 school closures. And so we are still kind of, I would say, on a rebound from that. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the next 4 to 5 years from those school closures. There's probably a lot of reasons for these lower than expected scores. And a lot of students come to kindergarten already doing really well in math. And then already we see on the first day of kindergarten, students are struggling with math. And a lot of that continues with students as they work through their school career. But I would say that one of the reasons that we see that so many students struggle with math are the systems that are in place in schools that may or may not allow students to develop that proficiency with math. I see systems related to identification of students who are struggling with math, and then having time within the school day or across the school year to really help students who struggle with math. Just because when we think about math learning, it takes time to learn math, and sometimes students need a little bit of time, some students need a lot more time, and when the school structures aren't in place to allow those students who need that more time to develop that math proficiency, then that carries with students from year to year, just because math is a entirely cumulative practice, and your earlier math impacts your later math. So I'll stop there and turn it over to the other panelists, and I'm sure we'll continue this math conversation throughout the morning.
Beth or Anson, do you want to jump in on this sort of this coherence question, sort of pick up there, or take it where you want?
Sure, I'll jump in. And Sarah had a lot to say, which is a lot of good stuff. There's a whole lot more to say because it's a big question. But I think
we got an hour, so we'll get into it.
Around the systems piece, it's consistency and coherence, right? Math is cumulative, and when a data point tells us something's not working, we change quickly. We don't give things enough time to actually see success, right? So we're chasing solutions, which is a good thing, right? I think folks have good intentions to help all of our kids learn math. When we see one data point, we might take a good thing that's implemented wrong and then throw it out, right? It's a good thing, right? And so there's a need to, I think, to be more consistent with what works over time and shift less to different solutions. Second thing I'd say is this idea around, I guess, like coherence, right? We'll discuss that, I think, more down the road. But since math is cumulative, if teachers and students are seeing different things from year to year, there's not a continuum of learning that connects first grade to second to third to fourth. And we know math is a building blocks. It's like playing basketball. You shoot your free throw first, then your layup first, and your free throw, and then three-pointer. You build to more complex shots. You build to more complex mathematics. And if you're changing practices over time, the building blocks do not connect. And so it's a big question, but I would say having coherence and consistency across systems is super important.
Beth, what do you want to add there, and where do you agree and disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with, I think, both of what Sarah and Anson shared. I mean, coherence is certainly one of the most important aspects, both from the fact, from a content perspective, right? Math is cumulative, it builds on each other. And then also from a systems perspective. So how are our curricular resources, our assessments sort of all speaking to each other so that we are able to get information that is helpful in making informed decisions? You know, I would add from the systems perspective, in my career, I've seen, and a lot of the work that I've focused on is around professional development related to math instruction. And, you know, as recent as 2025, the National Council on Teacher Quality produced a report showing that 1 in 4 elementary teachers reported feeling math anxiety. And so we're still, you know, in 2025 in a place where folks are showing up to classrooms not feeling confident in how to teach math, how to get at that conceptual understanding, how to Anson's point, really interpret the data and sort of use that data to stay the course or make informed, you know, decision points about when to pivot. You know, and so when teachers feel anxious, when teachers feel unprepared, it can have a really negative impact on student data. And so I would, you know, I think that more thought is needed around what is the type of professional learning that is required to support the type of instruction that's going to help us rebound from these math outcomes.
And let's just double click on that for a second, because this is like you often hear like people don't go into elementary school teaching to teach math, but the fact is you do have to teach math. You know, it's one of these cliches. People sort of say it as like a laugh line at conferences, but it's actually, it's both true and a bit of a problem because you do have to teach math. So talk about, you know, when you try to raise standards in this area, there's an intense amount of pushback. There's debates about how much math do you need to be able to know, you know, to teach it. Like, so unpack that a little more. Professional learning is a piece of it, but what also do we need to be thinking about in terms of pre-service and preparing teachers?
If I could jump in quickly just to add on to Beth's comment around teacher preparation and just like skill to teach math and belief in math, right? And mindsets with those teachers is also the leaders, right? Those coaches, the APs, assistant principals, deans of instruction, We're doing some work right now with a network in Texas, a district in Texas, large district, and they're improving their math instruction, right? Math practices, outcomes through leadership to coach teachers. And we had a recent conversation with the AP we've been working with past year, and she said, in all her 8 years of being an assistant principal, this is the first year she's actually experienced being better and coached to be a better math coach, right? And she's been doing this for 8 years. So imagine her great intention, but her feeling not adequate to teach math, what that does for the teacher in the instruction. And so now it's like, it has to be a through, again, coherence of systems, coherence of learning, coherence of PD. Those APs and principals and instructional coaches have to also have the skill to develop those teachers.
I'll add to that, Andy, kind of to Anson's point about developing leaders, but back to your original question about developing teachers. I think that this is one of the places where it is a little bit different from conversations related to reading, because particularly I think for leaders and for teachers, when we're thinking about mathematics, we not only think about, well, how do we teach math and support math, but also how do we understand the math? And so I think I train pre-service teachers here at my university, and it's always this balance of pedagogical skill, but also content knowledge for the teachers. And when I'm talking about content knowledge, I'm not talking algebra and calculus. I'm talking about, a few weeks ago, I was working with my teachers about how to teach counting. And do they know that there's 5 counting principles? And do they understand how each of those principles interact with one another? When it gets to fractions, do teachers understand there's 3 different models of fractions? And could they actually explain each of those and use representations to help students understand each of those models of fractions? And so it's not just like, are you a good mathematician? It's, do you understand the math at preschool? Do you understand what place value means? And can you explain that in multiple ways to your students? There's this big content knowledge bucket that not only would be helpful for teachers, but to Anson's point, would also be really helpful for leaders to understand, because so many people do say they're not a math person, but it doesn't take that much to go back and understand elementary math or understand middle school math so that you can teach it or support it adequately.
All right, Beth, where do you sort of agree or disagree there?
No, I agree with all of those.
Or do the Washington thing. What would you add? What's the question you want to answer that I didn't ask?
Yeah. No, I agree with all of that, right? I think that so much, the only thing I would add is, so I have found in professional learning, we need to have the content aspect that Sarah is talking about. We need to have the pedagogy, the how do you teach math? What are the practices? And then in the growing age of high quality instructional materials, which is part of the systems that I would argue are required for us to have that coherence, what does the professional learning look like to help teachers deeply understand the curriculum so that they can make informed decisions about what to read directly from the manual and what, adjustments to make for the students in front of their class? I think, so all of that is sort of agreed. I think going back to your very initial kind of big question around sort of the math, you asked about what are the math wars. I think that's where there is still debate in the math community around, we kind of all agree what the math content is, how do kids, what are the different principles, like Sarah mentioned, what are the 5 principles of counting that all, children need to acquire to be proficient counters? That's sort of agreed on. It's that middle bucket of pedagogy that I think there's debate right now around what are those practices, what are those effective, high quality practices that are going to drive to proficiency. And so as a math community, that's where a lot of the debate exists right now, but to the point of the math wars has been sort of going on for decades in terms of what happens in that middle bucket.
And let's just double click there. How much of that debate is also this larger debate that we have in education? It's flaring up again with AI around sort of knowledge versus skills, and sort of how much schools should be sort of imparting core sort of content knowledge, and how much it's about sort of what we used to call 21st century skills, now durable skills, these sort of this skills-based approach. And you see that flare up episodically. How much of that is sort of undergirding some of the friction points we're seeing in math?
Yeah, that is certainly an element of it, right? Because if our goal is solely to have higher proficiency or skill development, right, that can be measured on a standardized assessment, then absolutely there are ways that we can sort of drive towards that outcome and ignore things like critical thinking, problem solving, math identity, right, in the classroom, right? That becomes less of a point. And so I think that we need to really sit down first. I always talk about vision whenever we're designing a math system. What is our bigger goal that we are trying to accomplish? What do we believe kids need to acquire? Is it just being able to add 25 and 32? Is that the ultimate goal? Or is it that anytime they are presented with any double digit addition problem, they are able to find a strategy that is efficient and flexible and accurate for them to answer that question. And so, and in their own confidence, in showing up to that problem, feeling like they're able to tackle it, even if it's challenging at first. And so, absolutely, that's flaring up right now, that question of skills versus knowledge, like you said, as we think about AI. But it's sort of parallel, I would say, to the larger debate that has been going on around math instruction and what are we actually driving towards through math instruction.
Sarah, what would you add, and also double click on this issue of, how much of this should be sort of student focused and how much of this has to be like math's a content thing that you have to learn and you'll hear people, you're going to struggle with it until you master it. How should people think about that? Particularly, I would say like civilians who are not like deep in these debates and parents who are like how should they be thinking about that?
Yeah. I mean, to Beth's point, I think she spoke about that really well. Like the focus on the math wars is really around, I would think it distills down to how do we teach math, right? And there's not a lot of debate of, what content is important. And there can be some other conversations around, as you were talking about, knowledge versus skills. But when we think about how to teach math, there are different approaches that different groups promote, I would say. And to me, I think all of those approaches have merit, but for me, it's a time and place argument, right? And so I come from a background I really focus on students who struggle with math. And so when I'm thinking about students who struggle with math, I would say initially they need more systematic and explicit instruction so that they can engage more in that inquiry later on. I think there are other groups, and maybe Beth can help me out here, would say, we would like to see more inquiry on the front end so that students become better problem solvers in math, right? And I think that maybe distills this argument down a little bit simplistically, but to me, that's typically the main argument around the math wars. But there is a lot of research out there, not just in math, but in general, around some of the phases that students go through as they learn content. A lot of people talk about this idea of the instructional hierarchy, where students acquire initial knowledge, a big focus on accuracy, and then they move to that proficiency phase. Beth was just talking about being fluent and being efficient with your math. And then they generalize that knowledge to be able to think about, like, when do I use this strategy versus when do I not? And then they adapt it into novel situations. But a lot of the math wars, I think, focus on that acquisition phase of that learning, the very beginning, which is the best approach to support learners as they are learning about place value or about fractions or about algebra or whatever it might be. So those are, I would say, some of the examples that I think about when I'm asked about the math wars is what goes on in that acquisition phase of learning.
And Anson, how does this translate into so you're in schools, you're working with educators, it's hard if you're an educator and there's this conflict in the field among various respected groups. So how does that translate into this issue that you've been focused on around sort of systems and coherence and delivering that within schools and school systems?
Yeah. Before, again, just agreeing with both what Sarah and Beth said, but also I'll just name a couple anecdotes of where this stuff is working, right? Where we've seen large systems change. I think this is about policy, closing the gap between policy and practitioners and happens in classrooms. Alabama did some work. Alabama Numeracy Act, right? Was around for, I think, a few decades, whatever, about a decade, and really supporting kind of K-5 early math, early intervention with coaches and training for teachers. And you've seen them grow dramatically in math outcomes. Mississippi, similarly, early education, training for teachers, seen some growth. And then I would say my home state, Texas, is taking a perspective on belief that research-based practices matter and should be in classrooms, right? And what I would name is like, this change is not a one-day change. These are states who are putting money and funding over multiple years to drive this change. This is enduring change. So the first thing I'd say, Andy, is that this must be a multi-year approach. It's not a do it one time and fix it. It's got to be multi-iterative and fit the context of a specific district or system. The second thing I would add is that it needs to be embedded throughout a system. So thinking about the data systems, the training, the PD, the resources, management structures, all that matters to what the classroom instruction, right? If I'm doing HQIM, but my systems don't support that, then it's not going to work, right? And so you can't just adopt a resource and not think about the larger ecosystem of a district or a system. And so I would say the work we're doing is thinking about system change from like bottom up and top up, right? We're thinking about what are the things up top needs to be true to also affect the things bottom needs to be true, and how they go back and forth with that capacity of the people and resources. And it's working in places, right? It can work if done well. And then I would also name one more thing before I stop talking, idea of vision, right? Beth said so clearly, without a vision, you cannot make these shifts. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, before you make anything around like, let's do this, really think about what do you envision about mathematics for your district or network or school, and not just like high level vision, but vision as in you want to see teachers believing in doing these things. You want to see parents believing in doing these things, leaders believing in doing these things, kids believing in doing these things through that vision, and then build the systems to support that vision.
Let's stay there for a minute, because I think one of the visions that you're hearing is people hear what you just said, Mississippi, Alabama, there's some other states that are doing numeracy bills. And I'm hearing a lot of this, we should do a science of math. And in some cases, that's like, there's a body of evidence. In other cases, it's a political response that we've had a science of reading. And in some cases, that's been partisan associated. So people are like, we'll do science of math as a response. But there's some differences between sort of math and reading. And it's not that vision. It can't just be as simple as, okay, like let's just extrapolate straight out of what we did on science of reading, which has been quite successful, as we all know, in some states. So talk about the differences, particularly Beth and Sarah, on this issue of like, what are the differences between the science of math and science of reading, and how should people be thinking about that, particularly policymakers who might be interested in moving here?
Well, one of the things that Anson just talked about was relying on research validated practices. And I see that one of the things that often comes up when we're comparing a science of reading to the science of math is that there's not that much research in the area of math. While there isn't as much research as reading, and one of the reasons for that is that there's been a lot of money funneled into reading research over the last few decades. And there's a lot of money that's gone into math, it's not the same amount. But even though we're not talking that there's only 10 studies about math, there are hundreds, if not thousands of studies that have been conducted over the last few decades about, how do students learn math? What are some of the best teaching approaches to supporting math? And so while the proportion is higher in reading, there's still a lot out there that we can rely on in math. And there's a lot of research that comes from general education, from special education, from school psychology, from cognitive science. There's a lot out there. So we can start there, and hopefully over the next decade. Can you just
pause on that, just double click? We'll talk about real quickly the quality though, because that was the problem in reading. There was no shortage of studies, but a lot of them weren't, and people would sort of pile them up and actually look at them from like a rigor standpoint, what became known as SOR. So talk about like, do we have does that same problem sort of plague the math conversation?
I think there's some debate about that, but I would say for me, and probably Beth can speak to this as well, there's a lot of high quality research that's going on out there in math. From my interpretation of things, high quality research means often a randomized control trial where these students do this thing and other students don't do that. And then you compare those different approaches that the students have participated in across the school year. Also, to me, high quality research really relies a lot on quantitative outcomes to show that students in this school have improved their math outcomes compared to other students in other schools. And there's a lot out there, and we don't want to discount that. And I think it would be cheap to say, well, there's not enough research out there, let's not focus on this, because as we talked about at the beginning, we see that over 60% of students in the United States on average don't meet a minimum level of math proficiency in grade 4. We can't ignore those students who are sitting in schools as we are sitting on this webinar because, quote, there's not enough research out there. And so I think we have to look at the research that's out there, at least the highest quality research, and start there. And then as we move through thinking about supporting these students, collect real-time data to see if this is benefiting those students, or do we need to go a different direction?
Yeah.
I think that point underscoring we can't admire the problem when kids are moving through school.
Yeah.
I don't think we can sort of underscore the importance of that enough. And particularly when you look at some of the NAEP and you see like you can disagree about proficient and advanced, but like the percent of kids that are below basic, and particularly some of the equity things,
a huge concern.
Numbers. Yeah. Like it does seem like there's a level of urgency. Beth, I can see you trying. What do you want to?
Yeah, no, I would add, I mean, I would temper that, right? I think that there is the potential in this moment for, like you said, either bipartisan parties or, sort of people who are eager to be on that cutting edge. There is this opportunity for us to rush into a science of math that is codified in the same way that SOR was. And the science of reading was actually, the origins of it were, decades long, in terms of, it got popular in recent years, or it kind of reemerged in recent years, particularly in policy, but was a movement that had existed for quite a while. And the science of math, that wasn't a term that was kind of coined as long ago. And so I would say I agree with what Sarah mentioned earlier, which is that I think we have a risk right now of going too quickly or buying too much into this idea that that there's a binary math war upon us, where we have to choose to either have only explicit instruction or only inquiry instruction with no teacher guidance, and sort of those are what we're debating between, and you've got to make a choice, and that's what your state is going to have to now create as that system that Anson was talking about. And I would push everyone to be instead thinking about what are the merits that we're seeing in both, and take a look at the research that is being used on both sides, for sort of the arguments that are being made. Because to Sarah's point, well, there's not quite as much research in math as what we have in reading. There is quite a bit. And if we go too quickly, we run the risk of that data and research being interpreted in ways that fit the narrative that sort of, one of the, either side is trying to push in terms of a perspective. And what I would like to see is more conversation where we can more clearly identify, what, to Sarah's point, what was the group of students? What were the types of, what was it that we can learn about the types of learners that were studied in this? And what does that mean, in terms of the context of when we might choose different instructional practices? And what is this other, research? What can we really understand from that to have a more broad kind of perspective going into this? And it may not be kind of a science of math, but I agree with Anson, where that term research-based or research-backed, we're going to see a lot in ed policy soon. And that has a broad definition of what is the research that you're using to define research-based, and whose interpretation are you relying on? Well,
yeah, we slap a sticker on stuff is what ultimately happens. It's sort of a couple of steps till we get there, and then everything becomes research-backed. Yeah. I want to stay on this, and this question for all three of you. So Kareem Ani, who you may know, he founded Mathalicious, Citizen Math. He talks about, he's like, you probably didn't like, when he talks to people, he's like, you probably didn't like math in school, and you were right not to, because of how it was taught. Like he's just like, we teach it in super painful ways. And you were talking about sort of balancing, some of these skills around engagement with some of the skills around content. Like talk about like, I feel like people have either math anxiety or don't think they're math people. And some of it makes, we don't make it like super fun or engaging in a lot of it's the spinach of subjects, right? So talk about that.
That is heartbreaking to hear it. I've never heard it called the spinach of your instruction.
I'm laughing at that, Andy.
Part is, yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And you know, I've been a big fan of some of the work Kareem has done, you know, through the Mathalicious program for a while. And I always look in math classrooms for opportunities to bring the real world into the classroom and to help students kind of make connections between the relevance of the math, that is the concepts that are being taught in the math classroom. And I would also add, you know, to me, I think this really connects to going back to the piece that I said earlier. 1 in 4 of our elementary educators, you know, based on the study that I shared earlier, say that they have math anxiety. And so how are we creating classroom environments where students have a growth mindset around math, where they believe that math is, you know, something that can be developed through effort and persistence, and it's not fixed at birth. You know, I am not a math person, and, you know, Anson is not a math person, right? Like, we are both math people, and you know, that means that we may struggle in different areas, you know, but we can, through, again, effort and persistence, overcome that. And so I think, yes, creating math environments where the content is engaging and hooks kids in and makes them want to learn the math, gives them a reason to study the math, is important. But just as important is what are the conditions, what's the classroom environment around struggle, around trying hard, around growth mindsets, and the true belief that every single learner in this classroom is a math person and has incredible brilliance to add to this classroom, you know.
Sarah, Anson?
Yeah, to that I would add that a lot of students, we do a lot of work in middle school, and a lot of students really struggle with math and tell you that they hate math and that they don't feel that they're a good math student. And what we see is that they really struggle with so many of the earlier skills in math. And so thinking about not only supportive classroom environments, but making sure that when students have what I like to refer to as that unfinished learning, we might be talking about a 7th grader who is still struggling with 4th and 5th grade content. Of course, they're not going to love 7th grade math because it's hard for them. They are still struggling with multiplication or understanding of fractions. And so as we go back to thinking about those school structures absolutely have to be in place to then give that student time to finish that unfinished learning so that they can come back into the 7th grade classroom with all of that foundational skill in order to engage in that grade level content in a successful way. And if we don't have that in place for students, that 7th grader is going to go on to 8th grade and dislike math even more. And then they're going to go to high school and they're not going to choose math pathways. And for many students, math is the reason that they choose not to graduate from high school. And then they don't go into careers or into college pathways that rely on that math skill. And so I think that we also need to come back to, you know, what is the math learning that needs to occur for these students so that they can go on to the next grade level and be more and more successful with math.
Yeah,
go ahead, Beth.
If I could jump in, because my background, I started my career actually as an 8th grade special education teacher teaching in math classrooms. Yeah, and so much of that resonates, right? I would be working with my 8th graders on the quadratic formula, and they were struggling with multiplication, right? And so how do you kind of in that environment support students to, you know, recover that unfinished learning and also learn the quadratic formula so that they can be proficient, you know, 8th graders in math. And I just come back to, you know, again, I genuinely believe that, one, the perspective of believing that just because, you know, the student in front of me hasn't mastered multiplication doesn't mean they're never going to, or that they're deficient, or that, you know, that something is wrong with that child, right? But we have to believe that the child can absolutely learn multiplication, or learn to use the tools around them that are going to support them in multiplying proficiently with tools, for example.
Yeah. And I think have the time within the school day or within the school year to really let that student develop that knowledge.
Yeah.
Because it is, I think for many students, they see other students who are doing well in math and it seems like this magical thing, but it's not. That was developed through practice. But what cognitive science tells us is that some students need a little bit of practice to develop proficiency, and other students need a lot of practice to develop proficiency. Yet our classroom math time is finite, and it's typically the same amount of time for all students, which really is, that's how the school day functions. But that doesn't make sense from a learning perspective, knowing that Anson may need 20 minutes to develop proficiency on something, but I need 60 minutes to develop proficiency on something. And then as we move through every day of the school year and then subsequent school years, that unfinished learning amasses, so that, as Beth is talking about, by 8th grade, we still have students who struggle with multiplication, and they can do it. They just need time to allow that multiplication knowledge to develop.
Yeah.
Anson, this too just sounds like such a systems problem, right? So I'm thinking, like, I can't listen to this conversation. I keep thinking about like Joel Rose and New Classrooms, which I should know in the interest of transparency New Classrooms has been a client of Bellwether in the past. And what they're doing is they map out these skills and these precursor skills, and they're like very targeted about it. And if you're with New Classrooms, you're able to have that kind of coherence, but you don't see that inside a lot of systems. So kids, in addition to the time thing, kids are moving grade to grade, and there's not a lot of attention to what are the skills they're lacking. They're sort of starting over again each year with teachers, and with everything in terms of like how this timelines for getting assessment information back, opportunities for teachers to communicate in schools around this. So I mean, this too, Anson, just seems like something that if we thought in more systems terms rather than grade by grade or sort of balkanized.
Yes. I mean, also the thing that Sarah and Beth talked about are not just math things. That's good teaching, right? And so I hate when we like say the math wars. Some of it's not math. It's good teaching practices. It's culture. It's systems, things you talked about. What are the coherence, the conversation between teachers from grade to grade have to be in place, regardless, whatever the content is, right? So when I see schools who are doing well, they might be doing 3 math things great, but the systems they have in those schools are what holds those things down, right? The communication between parents and the teacher, the communication between teacher to teacher, the data analysis between the teacher and the student. Those are things that drive that change. The belief that every kid can do well, and actually belief drives actions, right? Allowing kids to do the math. So I was a math major, actually, was not good in school in elementary, but I had an uncle who believed in me. He worked for IBM. I got lucky, right? Had an engineer as an uncle. So he taught me math. But I would say, like to Sarah's point, there is this balance of like knowing explicit instruction works, also conceptual instruction works. I worked with Sarah many, many years ago when I was leading schools, and we did some work in middle school together. And one thing that stood out to me is that this idea of read, draw, write, right? Kids need to read the problem, draw the problem, and then put in math terms. That supports all students, right? Not just my bilingual students, not my students with special needs, but all students. When I, as a teacher or a coach, has that practice in my classrooms, in all my classrooms, this is a skill or practice that all kids can do, right? But as a teacher, I have to allow kids to do that, right? I have to believe that every kid can actually do the math, read the problem, draw the picture, write the equation. And if I don't allow them to do that, there's no practice, right? So it's not always just the math research. It's what is the system driving to say these are practices, regardless of mathematics, that are in every classroom, every school.
I want to bring in a few of our commenters and remind you can put questions in the chat. And actually, one of the great things about this platform is some of the questions are directed very much to specific panels. I think there was a question earlier for Sarah about a particular resource, and they'll be able to engage afterwards as well. And you can have conversations in the comment section after the webinar's over. But go ahead and put those. One, there's a question in there. Someone says a lot of this sounds suspiciously like a balanced literacy argument, which was sort of a way that practices that weren't evidence-based were sort of smuggled back into reading, and despite, as has been pointed out here, like ample evidence going back a fairly long way. What's the risk here with that some of this, like, as soon as often in education, as soon as people say balanced or it's both, what it really means is I'm going to do the thing that I think. What's the risk here?
I agree. I saw that comment come in, and I do think that it does sound a little bit like balanced literacy. As a comment I made earlier, for me, it's about time and place. And from the research that I do and that I really rely on a lot for students who struggle with math, is that students need foundational skill, and often that's developed through, I would say, that explicit instruction, right? A lot of modeling, a lot of practice, a lot of feedback, and so on, so that students can go and be more successful with inquiry later on. I think Beth would probably flip that script a little bit, but I'll let her speak to that. So I think it is a little bit of a balance, but also knowing when students require certain instructional approaches, particularly when they are learning that foundational math.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that I think time and place. And so what going back to that example of the 8th grade teacher with the student who's struggling in multiplication, I think a lot of it, again, goes back to what's the professional development for how we learn how to teach math. And so if I'm sitting as an 8th grade teacher and I understand the ways in which students develop multiplication thinking, starting in first and second grade, even thinking about equal groups, I'm better equipped then to think about what is the right approach for me to intervene at the right level, for this particular student. And I would say I probably sit a little bit more on the argument of guided inquiry, of creating spaces where students have what I call low floor, high ceiling tasks, where you can have that productive struggle, but it's guided and it's intended to be with a highly, skilled adult asking questions and coming in at the right moment to sort of guide the learning to a particular outcome. There are things where explicit instruction is it's the right time and the right place. And so to me, again, it comes back to how much time are we investing in the professional development of the adults, the teachers in the classroom, and to Anson's earlier point, the leaders at the school level and systems level, so that we can really pay attention to the topic of study, the child in front of us, the classroom of students, and make those informed instructional choices that help students develop confidence and proficiency in mathematics.
Yeah, I want to add something too.
Go ahead, Anson. Yeah, please.
To that point, I think, because this is where the debate continues, right? Because I was a math teacher, I coach math major, I have kids who do math. I love mathematics, right? However, I do think there is a balance depending on the context. If I have 45-minute classrooms, right? 45 minutes, I cannot do as much inquiry and guided practice or guided inquiry as someone who's in 90-minute classrooms. Let's be honest, right? I have 45 minutes, I have a state assessment to give in 7 many, months. I have to think thoughtfully about how do I do explicit instruction versus the guided inquiry. If I have an hour and a half class every day with my kids, I can balance that more. So there is this debate, but also debate is contextual, right? Both things matter. Balancing inquiry, conceptual, and explicit are important, but also in the context of your barriers, right? And so again, 80 minutes versus 45 minutes are differences, right?
Yeah.
Where your kids come in are differences, right? And so I can't say it's one size fits all. You have to understand what works and put it in the context of your school community and your students.
Well, Anson, that goes back to the structures idea, right? There are schools that have decided, just as we have a 90-minute ELA block, there are schools that say we have a 90-minute math block every day, but then there are also schools that say we do math for, as your example, 45 minutes a day, right? And that creates huge differences in the opportunities that, as Beth was talking about, that teachers have to provide those instructional supports to students. And I think as both of you are talking, this also goes back to structures in place for early intervention. Beth and I both talked about middle school students who struggle with math. And it is likely that those middle school students who struggled with math in fifth grade, probably third grade, and probably even first grade. But there's this hyper focus in the United States on early identification of reading difficulty. And, that is correct. We should be focused on that. But I would say we also need to be hyper focused on identifying math difficulty and identifying it early. On the first day of kindergarten, there are already wide disparities in what students know about mathematics. And so we need to be screening and identifying students in kindergarten and providing intervention in kindergarten and first and second grade so that students can plop into third grade and move along at that grade level pace. But if schools don't have that structure in place for early screening and early intervention, and to Beth's point, teachers who know how to intervene adequately with students at an early grade level, we are going to continue to see a large number of students move into middle school and high school spaces, continuing to struggle with math. And it's a lot harder to intervene with 8th graders who struggle with math than it is for 1st graders who struggle with math.
Yeah, I would just add from a structures perspective, I think the same thing is true with the time, what you both were speaking about with respect to the time, right? I think, that example of sort of in 45 minutes, we don't get to do the guided instruction, right? We don't have time for it. Well, it goes back to what is our end goal here? Is it just sort of being able to, robotically do the skills so that you can show proficiency on the test? Or is it, because that's where and I'm not suggesting that's what you said, Anson, but I think that's the trap that we can fall into and I see it across the country. There's this pressure, right? That we have to kind of get to the test. And so we believe that, sort of if I just kind of give it to the kids and have them practice it, then that's going to show the proficiency and then they'll move on. But from my experience, that's where some of those gaps appear, because you're getting short-term mastery that's not deeply, it's not true, deep, rich conceptual understanding. And so going back to those systems, I agree, systems around progress monitoring, systems around intervention, systems around professional development, and a real commitment to how much time during the day are we dedicating to math instruction. And if we truly want to rapidly change performance in our country, we have to make a commitment to the minutes of instruction that we are dedicating to math.
Yeah, you guys are surfacing, I think it's good, some very actionable policy things, screening, what Sarah was talking about, some things, structure of day, that's a practice thing. So a couple of quick lightning round questions on that. We've gotten 8th grade algebra. The question in the chat, like, everybody should, not necessary, nobody should.
Well, from my point of view, thinking about,
like, what should the policy be on that, or the best practice?
Well, kind of back to our conversation about math is cumulative. Students have unfinished learning. If students are not prepared for 8th grade algebra, we should not force students into that. There's a lot of students who would benefit from an 8th grade math year instead of an 8th grade algebra year. And many students who are being pushed into algebra early, they're really struggling with that because they don't have that earlier skill that can help them be successful with algebra.
Yeah, I would agree. I think what I have seen, because I've worked with schools that have done algebra for all, and I've worked in schools where there's tracking and it's algebra for some, and I've worked in schools where it's algebra for none. And I think there are so many questions at the heart of that debate around equity and access that I don't think it's a lightning round question. But if you are going to do algebra for all, you've got to really then double down on some of those systems that Sarah was talking about around time and intervention. Because if it's algebra for all, what are the resources and the time that you're going to dedicate to ensure that all students are successful? Because there's also a lot of research that if you fail algebra 1, it is challenging to recover. And so if we're going to do it, we've got to make the commitment to do it well.
And how much of it is also, like, something I've noticed, if you're to the tracking point, if you're taking algebra, you're likely on a different schedule than a lot of other kids. And so you're getting access to other classes. You're more likely to be potentially getting access to other kinds of honors classes and so forth. So it again, it becomes like a broader structure question than an algebra per se question. It's just putting you in opening or closing different opportunities to you.
Yeah, I do think it's also context, right? Because I've seen schools who, as Beth said and Sarah said, based off where their needs are, they may take an 8th grade math course, but they have the chance when they develop that skill to accelerate in algebra to catch up to their classmates, right? And so again, what's that vision you would have, your course sequences? So to the question, who asked the question around 8th grade math, it's a debate, but I think at the core of it is, like, we have to ensure our kids are prepared for career. And that may look different, right, depending on where a student is, but we should not say one size fits all, right? Again, it is a continuum of learning, right? So I do think thinking about that end goal, how do we make sure everything's successful? And that may mean this student is accelerated, this student is a different pathway, but getting to, life choices, having opportunity is the end goal.
So another question that's come up that it's not a lightning round question. We're gonna have to do it as a little bit of a lightning round is a retention. And I think, everybody agrees the only reason you should retain a kid is for football. It's a contentious issue, and you've seen that in reading, and states are approaching sort of retention policies in different ways with regard to literacy. And Carrie Wright recently had a very interesting comment in an article. I'm trying to remember the publication. Where she was like, somebody was talking about what she did in Mississippi and what she's doing in Maryland. She was the state chief for a lot of what they did in Mississippi on reading, and she's like, Maryland, the context is different than it is in Mississippi, and policies are going to look different as a result. It was a very interesting observation with our experience in those places. But retention, is there a role? If so, where, when, how should people? It's something that comes up a lot. It's something that policymakers seize on because it's a lever that's like clear and actionable. How should we be thinking about retention at these key points with regard to what you guys have been talking about with making sure kids have these skills to move forward?
I don't know if I want to focus on retention as much as going back to school structures. If students don't, this kind of gets to a comment that just came in about, many times our math curriculum is a mile wide and an inch deep, but what are the essential skills that we see are absolutely important from grade level to grade level? And maybe we see that third graders, do not develop or do not show proficiency in those 7 or 8 skills, whatever it might be. Maybe the question isn't retention, but maybe the question is, what is the school going to do about this next year so that students get a double dip of math? They get all of their grade level content and they get 30 minutes of math intervention 5 days a week. And so perhaps it's not always a retention issue as much as it's a school structures issue, but it's financially easier to retain than it is financially easier to put an intervention in place and hire interventionists and have more time in the school day for students to develop that math knowledge. But there's some really good documents out there. Achieve the Core has a nice progression document of what are the essentials to help students be successful in algebra in 8th grade. And many schools should be reflecting upon, are all of our first graders leaving here with these 7 skills, or these third graders, are they leaving here to go to 4th grade with these essential skills? So I would maybe put on the retention question and focus more on the intervention question.
Well, and we're seeing in reading, part of the retention is what happens to kids who are retained. And if it's the same week instruction, then you're wasting everybody's time. And if it's some sort of structured intervention, you can see different kinds of outcomes.
Because if you retain, but then don't provide additional support, you're not going to do anything, right? It's like, it's that additional time and that additional support that absolutely is essential.
When I was a principal and I led schools and I led principals, I really pushed on not holding kids back. The research says you hold mostly Black boys, adolescents, right? And they usually fail the game, right? They don't graduate, right? So you're just adding to this process of like inequity and, giving them less chances in life. With that being said, there are gaps you got to close. And so for me, I always push my team on what's going to be different next year with him, us, and the parent, right? Because it's a 3-way street, right? Like we're connecting. And so it's not always, again, you might be like, well, no, it is a community. It is the school, it is the student, and how do we work together to make a different year for this kid, whether we retain him or accelerate him, what's going to be different? And I think so, like, the question is like not retention, is what's going to be different, improve this kid's experience on all of us for that following year.
Talk quickly about, we've got a question on math specialists. Like, is part of this also like a staffing question, if you can bring in additional support? So, we've been talking about this very much in sort of a teacher-centered model. Like, what's the role of bringing in specialists, other adults to support kids, and some of the stuff you all are talking about, like making it different?
That would be incredible. I think to Beth's point that she's made several times today, math coaches at the elementary level who can really support the professional development and the coaching of the current teachers that are there, but also having more math interventionists in a school. Often schools have several reading interventionists. I've never been in a school that has the same number of math interventionists, even though typically more students struggle with math in the school than struggle with reading. That goes to that hyper focus on reading, but we really need to push at the school level, the district level, and the state level. Whatever we are doing in reading, we need to be doing those similar support structures in math.
And what about technology? Because there's a big pushback happening right now on screens, and it's a result of concern about a number of things. At the same time, there's a thrust to start using AI more. Like, what's the role of ed tech technology in teaching math?
Well, I have a perspective that I can share, but
Please.
To me, tech-guided instruction is almost the same as what I would argue is sort of inquiry without guidance, right? If you just put the student on the screen and allow them to go through that independently, I have not seen it lead to great enthusiasm for math. I haven't seen it lead to great proficiency in math. It's sort of either over gamified so that it's more about the game than the math skills, or it's sort of skill and drill, kind of repetitive math without that deep conceptual understanding. And so I think there's a time and place for technology in the classroom. I think it can enhance learning. I've seen great activities where, kids are using digital tools to explore the mathematics through either online manipulatives or videos that bring the mathematics to life. But I would always encourage educators to be involved in that exploration. What are the specific skills that a student should be working on? What is the conversation when a student is, struggling on that computer program with a particular skill, so that you're not relying on the computer to replace that either guided instruction.
And then finally, a question. We're coming up on time. Question for all three of you. It's A250 this year, America's 250th anniversary. We've had a good run. Hopefully we've got another 250 in us, or 5. Talk about math and civics, because it seems like math is actually a pretty important civic skill in terms of being able to make sense of the world, make sense of things. You're more, I'll editorialize, you're more likely to be confused about the results of elections if you can't think about big numbers and so forth. And you're more likely to make lots of mistakes in your life if you don't understand basic ideas like base rates and understanding like how to think about changes and differences and so forth. And all that fundamentally, those are math skills. So just talk about just in your own view as three, accomplished practitioners on this issue, like what's as we think about sort of civics and renewing our civic spirit at the A250, what is the role of, you don't hear a lot about math with that, but what is the role of math in that?
I'm happy to start again. So math, to me, I love this question because math is the language of informed citizenship. Mm-hmm. You brought up the example of election results. I would add that understanding statistics allows you to better understand how in advertising and marketing that those statistics may be used kind of against you or to sway you in a particular perspective, right? In the same way that when you understand author's craft, you can sort of pick up in a newspaper article like, hey, this person's trying to sort of get me to this, end goal, right? So, and I think also being able to interpret data helps us hold institutions and decision makers accountable as informed citizens. And so absolutely, there is so much math, from applying for a credit card and understanding interest rates to being able to understand headlines that is required for us to, that is a civic responsibility for us to graduate students proficient in math. And so absolutely.
Is anyone else?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, I think for the future of our country, we think about math achievement. Folks who are on the lower income part of the spectrum in this country are 3 times less on performance when it comes to the NAEP, when it comes to those who are more affluent, right? That's a problem. That's a gap, right? That gap leads to life choices and life decisions to better our country. The second thing is, I think math is, for me personally, is not an option to be successful in. I think it's just like reading, it's just like literacy, right? It opens up so many doors for us as individuals. But secondly, knowledge is power, right? You may not use the math every day, but the concepts of math are transferable, right? The concepts of balance, the concepts of of proportionality that can span mathematics to language to English to poetry to all kinds of things, right? So just the fullness of life you have. This is me thinking, being a math guy, but you have a fuller life if you understand math at its core. And so the optimist in me is like, it gives you a better life, but also it just gives us more equity as a country to lift folks up and lift themselves up for life choice and success.
Sarah, anything you want to add there? And I would just note on math also, is that to know?
Yeah, they said it.
And I think that's well said by both. I would also just add, like, we've decided with that now everybody gets to have a casino in their pocket. And so we should probably be like, it probably wouldn't kill us to arm young people with some math skills. You guys talked about statistics, probability, and so forth. So speaking of probability, I think it's a high probability that people listening learn something. That was a great discussion. I know I did. I really appreciate you all giving us your time and your thoughts. People can find you through LinkedIn. It's very easy with this format. They can also continue to engage with you around specific questions in the chat. So in addition to thanking you, I want to thank everybody who asked questions, everybody who listened either now or is going to listen in the future with this. And thank our producer, Mackenzie, for corralling us all. So I hope everybody else, we started the day with math. So how can your day not, depending on your perspective, it's either the high point of your day or your day can only get better. But I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.